Hi, Mom. So we are still reading chapter 20, I believe. Darn it, I forgot to check. 21, sorry. Return to Jerusalem, because remember, Rachel is hoping to return to Jerusalem. And she's going to stay with Ellie for a little while until I think she can figure out how to get into the old city that's guarded by the motif. Ellie spotted Uncle Howard in the lobby of the Hasada Hospital. Immediately, he sat on the edge of a long row near empty chairs. His face was unshaven, his clothes were rumpled. In his hands, he held a small pocket Bible that he always carried. As he studied the pages, his face was a strange mixture of sorrow and peace. Miriam's beautiful Sunday shawl lay folded neatly beside him on the chair. As Ellie turned toward him, leaving the others to wait by the door, a dark foreboding filled her heart. Uncle Howard! She leaned down and hugged him tightly. Then, picking up the shawl, she sat beside him, gazing pensively into his eyes. Howard drew a deep breath and blinked back tears. Such a waste, such a terrible waste. Sammy? She asked. He'll live. Broken arm, cuts, that's all. Thank God. Ishmael? Howard shook his head slowly. No, he replied simply. Uncle Howard! Ellie cried, her voice cracking with emotion. Poor Miriam! Poor dear old Miriam! She glanced around the lobby. Where is she? Is she all right? Howard placed his hand on Ellie's arm. No, she's gone, child. Gone? Gone where? Is she home? No. She clutched the woman's shawl closer to her, afraid of the answer. A lone tear trickled down Howard's cheek as he tucked his chin and tried to speak. Ellie's eye filled with painful comprehension as he cleared his throat, wiped away the tear with the back of his hand. She stayed with them last night, he said finally, at the hotel. Miriam! And she buried her face into Miriam's shawl, pressed to her loss. She's safe now, child. Howard wrapped his arms around her. She has gone home. That makes me almost cry, Mom. Miriam died. The last of 30 bodies were recovered today from the rubble at the Samarias Hotel in the Jerusalem suburb of Canamon. Although Haganah sources deny any involvement with the bombing, other sources indicate the hotel was being used as a military headquarters by the Arabs. No members of the Arab military staff were present, however. Only civilians were numbered among the victims. The British High Command called this last act of violence by the Jews against the Arabs dastardly, the murdering of innocent people. Hajamin lowered the newspaper and fixed his eyes on the face of Rabbi Akiva, sitting across from him on the patio. A vile act. Do you not agree, Rabbi? He asked grimly. Rabbi Akiva shook his head in shame that the Jews had resorted to such acts against innocent population. My heart is breaking that these would call themselves Jews. You see our dilemma then. If we were to allow passage into the Jewish quarter, what guarantee would we have that the old city would not be polluted with these Jewish fanatics, these murderers of innocent among my people? It was my thought, Hajamin, that perhaps an arrangement could be made for the sake of my people in the old city. Hajmin's eyebrows raised slightly with interest. An arrangement? Akiva toyed with the watch chain stretched across his belly. It has occurred to me that we might make a little exchange. There is a possibility that I might obtain something you want very badly. Hajamin leaned forward and gazed intently at Akiva. And what do you have that I could possibly desire, my friend? Victory. That is mine at any rate. Hajamin shrugged and leaned back in his chair. Are you so very sure? Avika smiled knowingly. Hajamin cleared his throat, then poured coffee for Avika and himself. And for this promise of victory against the Zionists, what would you receive in return? Avika confidently sipped his coffee. The preservation of the Jewish quarter for the sake of my people. The places of learning, the synagogues. Ah, yes. Hajamin smiled. Immortality for the name of Avika. Savior of the old ways? Just as the name of Haj Amin Husseini shall also be immortal among his people. That goes without saying. Haj Amin set his cup on the low table before him. Immortality, a simple enough request. I thought perhaps we would see eye to eye. Avika tugged on his vest. There is one more item that I required, he added, certain that such a small request would be honored without question. Of much less value than the old city, I presume? It is but a whim of a poor scholar such as yourself. Avika bowed his head humbly. A small thing of little interest to anyone else, and certainly of no importance whatsoever to the world. In exchange for victory? Hajamin smiled shyly. What can this request be, small as it is? I find the photographs of the scroll quite intriguing, a story of its discovery even more so. I would very much like to study this thing and have it in my library for reference. Ha! Hajamin coughed delicately into his handkerchief, then raised his chin to scrutinize the man sitting opposite him. Perhaps we can accommodate your wishes, Rabbi. He paused for full effect. But at present, of course, we have some use for this item. But perhaps later, when it has served its purpose, we shall make it a gift to you. What possible use could you have for such old scrolls of our prophets? Hajamin's face hardened for a brief instant. Then he sipped his coffee. Is it not written that your own holy books, that the word of God draws men unto itself? So now we're going to the next chapter, which is The Gift, 1974, the Passover Hope. Ellie stared blankly into the developing tray as the rubble of the Samaris Hotel magically began to appear on the photographic paper. Here, a rescue worker stood on a demolished wall where another carried a first aid kit that would be of little use. Two other men pulled yet another body from the heap of stones, while other men were moving things brick by brick to mark the end of 30 innocent lives. How, Ellie wondered, can one photograph hope to tell the whole story? She rubbed her hand across her forehead in utter exhaustion. From the first hour that she had heard of Miriam's death 2 afternoons before, she had not slept. Instead, she went to the site with Moshe and wept as she snapped the shutter of her camera, etching her own heartache permanently on film. The bells had begun their mournful tolling as she photographed the rescue of a solitary little Arab girl, a lone survivor among a Christian family of 13. Since that moment, the bells of the old city churches had not ceased to toll out the lives of the dead in solemn, unbroken rhythm. From behind the thick walls of her dark room, Ellie could hear them still. The hills of Jerusalem, which only a few weeks before had echoed with joyful calls for shofar, now reverberated with the death toll of reason and sanity. From the minarets of the Arab quarter, the Muezzin shrilly called the faithful to prayer, and yet another sermon by the Mutif. And as the Christian Arabs began to dig their graves hastily and bury their loved ones, the Muslims gathered in the courtyard of the Mosque of Omar, raised their fist with the frenzied cry of Jihad, Jihad. Holy war. Ellie looked down at the photograph once again. At pretense of detached professionalism, it evaporated. She bowed her head, covered her face with her hands. Oh God, she cried aloud, this can't be what you want. I've got some kind of war going on inside me. God, I don't want to fight against you anymore, she sobbed. Miriam knew you, but she's gone, and I'm still down here, helpless, buried so far beneath the rubble that she could never dig herself out. Help me, she cried, tasting warm salt of tears. She laid her head on the counter and closed her eyes. She wished the bells would stop ringing. Find me, she murmured, and then she sighed and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. The bells of the churches in the neighboring Christian quarter tolled mournfully. Grandfather pulled his coat tighter around him and hurried up the street of the stairs toward the massive three-story structure of the Warsaw compound. Here he had walked to as a boy, and he had come to Jerusalem from the Jewish ghetto of Warsaw, Poland, to study the Torah. He had never returned. Instead, he had grown old and bent teaching the new Polish yeshiva students in study rooms and synagogues that surrounded the large, peaceful courtyard. His beard was gray. His hands were gnarled from the well over half a century of turning pages of holy books. Only Warsaw compound remained unchanged. Many, many lifetimes before Grandfather had been born, the Jews of Poland had built it as a memorial to the God of their fathers within the gates of Zion. Generations had sent their sons to study here, like Grandfather. Some had remained, but most returned to the land of their birth. Now there were no new Polish yeshiva boys. They had died with their father in the streets of a Warsaw ghetto as Nazi divisions had blasted their resistance to rubble. They died fighting, Grandfather thought. Only in this small corner of the world remains as a memorial to what once was, and now we too are threatened with extinction. All in all, the empty promises of Abbai, Rivka, and Hajamin, the friend of Hitler, made no difference. The Warsaw Building stood on the corner of two of the most exposed flanks of the old city Jewish quarter. In the living quarters, the scholars had become like trenches and bomb shelters. Sandbags blocked the windows against the gunfire. At night, turned up tables barricaded the doors. 3 residents of a northeast corner of the quarter had been wounded from sniper fire from the Marionettes only 2 days since the bombing of the hotel in the new city. Bullet holes marred the faces of every building. Members of the Haganah had been denied entrance into the old city in exchange for Arab promises to Avika, that the Jewish quarter would be spared. The few meager weapons that had been confiscated by the British. Now it seems that those promises had been lies calculated to delay the building of any defense whatsoever. Perhaps Avika believed the lies. Grandfather reasoned. Perhaps he had some other purpose for resisting the help of the Jewish defenders in the new city. Avika cried out against the Zionists, but that was no longer the issue. Everything was now focused down to the tiny pinpoint of mere survival for the Jewish quarter. This morning, 10 rabbis from among differing sectors of the quarter had been invited to an urgent meeting. Come, let us reason together. Grandfather prayed silently. The Warsaw Building loomed just ahead, yet for Grandfather it seemed almost beyond reach. Pain welled up in his chest as he staggered and tried to catch his breath. His cough had grown worse over the past few weeks. Even in the brutal morning colds, beads of perspiration formed on his forehead. He leaned heavily on the side of a low, one-story structure and closed his eyes. So, God, are you finished with this old man so soon? He coughed, doubling over with the force. A little more time, if you please, for Yakov. For a full 5 minutes he fought against the pain, feeling it gradually lessen and fade from a hot fire to a dull ache. He stood erect, shakily resumed his walk toward Warsaw, where the other 9 members of the group waited to discuss survival. "We will survive," he whispered, gazing at the only corner of the world where the Warsaw of his childhood still remained. Okay, so that's, wow, he's pretty sick and old. I hope he makes it home. All right, have a great